Before the fire fell from heaven, before the rain returned, and before the prophet known as Elijah was taken from the earth without tasting death, something happened that changed the course of Israel forever. A single man walked into the presence of a powerful king and delivered a terrifying message. There would be no rain, no warning, no army, no explanation. And then he disappeared. But where did he go? How did a man hiding beside a dying stream survive a famine that was destroying an entire nation? Why did God send him into the very land from which Israel's greatest religious threat had come? And how could this same prophet later stand alone against hundreds of priests and call down fire from heaven? Yet, the greatest mystery was still ahead. Because after everything Elijah had witnessed, fire, miracles, death, and divine power, he would one day stand at the edge of the Jordan and leave this world in a way almost no human being in biblical history ever had. This is the story of Elijah, the prophet who never died.
Before the chariot of fire came, before the whirlwind descended and the horses of heaven appeared, and a man was taken from the surface of the earth without tasting death in the way that every other human being who has ever lived has tasted it. Before that extraordinary, unprecedented, theologically staggering moment on the banks of the Jordan River, when the boundary between earth and heaven became permeable in a way it had only been permeable once before, in the translation of Enoch, who walked with God and was not, for God took him. Genesis 5 verse 24, before any of that, there was a word. A single, direct, unannounced word delivered by a man who appeared in the biblical narrative with no introduction, no genealogy beyond the bare mention of his origin, no account of his childhood or his formation or the circumstances of his call. Just the word. And the man who carried it. His name was Elijah, the Tishbite. From Tishbe in Gilead, a region east of the Jordan, outside the mainstream of Israelite religious and cultural life, a place that the sophisticated centers of the kingdom barely noticed. And he walked into the presence of the King of Israel and delivered a message that would alter the course of a nation's history and begin one of the most dramatic prophetic careers in the entire Old Testament. Now Elijah the Tishbite, of Tishbe in Gilead, said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word." 1 Kings 17 verse 1. Neither dew nor rain, except by my word. The declaration was not merely meteorological. It was theological, a direct confrontation with the central claim of the religious system that King Ahab and his wife Jezebel had been installing throughout the northern kingdom of Israel. Baal, the Canaanite storm god, the deity of rain and fertility and agricultural abundance. The god to whom Ahab and Jezebel had devoted the most elaborate religious infrastructure Israel had yet seen in the service of a foreign deity, the temple of Baal in Samaria, the altar to Baal, the Asherah pole, the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who ate at Jezebel's table. 1 Kings 16 verses 32 to 33, 1 Kings 18 verse 19, the claim of Baal worship was the claim that Baal controlled the rain. That the fertility of the land depended on the favor of Baal. That the agricultural abundance of Canaan was the product of devotion to the storm deity of the Canaanite pantheon rather than the covenant faithfulness of the God of Israel. Elijah's declaration was a direct and total refutation of that claim. There shall be neither dew nor rain, the specific elements of Baal's supposed domain, except by the word of the prophet of the God of Israel. Not by Baal's mercy. Not by the prayers of Baal's 450 prophets. By Elijah's word. The declaration placed the entire question of who controlled the rain, and therefore who was actually God, before the nation and the king in the starkest possible terms. The drought that Elijah was announcing was not merely a weather event. It was a theological demonstration. A divine referendum on the question that the religious politics of Ahab's reign had attempted to answer in Baal's favor. Who is God? Who controls the rain? Who holds the power of fertility and death and the fundamental sustaining forces of the created order? The drought would answer that question with 3 years of unanswerable evidence. But to understand the full weight of what Elijah was doing when he walked into Ahab's presence and delivered that declaration, we must understand who Ahab was and what he had done. Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all who were before him. And as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, he took for his wife Jezebel the daughter of Ethbaal king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. 1 Kings 16 verses 30-31, more than all who were before him. The assessment of Ahab in the biblical record is the most comprehensively negative of any Israelite king up to that point in the narrative. More than all who were before him. The sins of Jeroboam, the golden calves at Bethel and Dan, the corruption of the Levitical priesthood, the calendar manipulation, had been the standard against which subsequent northern kings were measured. Ahab exceeded that standard. And the specific form of his excess was the importation and institutionalization of Baal worship through his marriage to Jezebel. Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal king of the Sidonians, a woman from the Phoenician coastal culture whose religious devotion to Baal was not a private matter of personal piety but an aggressive, state-sponsored, politically backed campaign to replace the worship of the God of Israel with the worship of the Canaanite storm deity throughout the northern kingdom. She was not merely a wife who had brought her foreign religion with her. She was an active persecutor of the prophets of the Lord, cutting off the prophets of the Lord, 1 Kings 18 verse 4, the language implying systematic elimination, the organized attempt to silence the voices that spoke in the name of the God of Israel. The 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah ate at Jezebel's table. The state was funding, feeding, and supporting the religious infrastructure of Baal worship at the direct personal expense of the queen. Into this situation, into the most comprehensively Baal-saturated political and religious environment in the history of the northern kingdom, Elijah the Tishbite walked with a single sentence and a declaration that the rain would stop. The courage required for that act was the courage of a man who understood that the word of the Lord was more real than the power of any king or queen, that the God before whom he stood was more sovereign than any storm deity the Canaanite imagination had constructed, and that the truth spoken to power in the name of that God was more important than whatever personal consequence the speaking might produce. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand. The oath communicating the ground of Elijah's authority, he stood before the living God, and from that standing before the living God he spoke to the earthly king with the authority of the one before whom all earthly kings were themselves required to stand. And then God said to him, "Go. Leave the king's presence. Leave the city. Go hide yourself. Go to the brook Cherith that is east of the Jordan, and there you shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." 1 Kings 17 verses 2-4, Go hide yourself. The command to hiddenness after the moment of public confrontation was not the command of a God abandoning his prophet. It was the command of a God protecting his prophet in the period between the declaration and the confrontation, in the years of the drought during which the word Elijah had spoken was being demonstrated before the entire nation. Ahab and Jezebel, faced with the economic and agricultural catastrophe of a 3-year drought, would be looking for the man who had declared it. Go hide yourself. And in the hiddenness, in the obscurity of the brook Cherith, east of the Jordan, God would provide. So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the brook Cherith that is east of the Jordan. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. 1 Kings 17 verses 5-6, the ravens brought him bread and meat. The provision was specific and daily and entirely contrary to the natural behavior of ravens, birds that are scavengers, that take food rather than bring it, that are classified in the Mosaic law as unclean birds. Leviticus 11 verse 15, the God who had declared that the rain would stop by the word of his prophet was providing for his prophet through the most unlikely possible instruments, unclean birds bringing food twice daily to a man hiding by a brook in the wilderness. The provision was miraculous in its specificity and its consistency. Not once or twice but every morning and every evening, for as long as the brook had water. And after a while the brook dried up, because there was no rain in the land. 1 Kings 17 verse 7, the brook dried up. The drought that Elijah had declared was affecting the very source of the provision that God had arranged for his prophet. The word of judgment that Elijah had spoken before the king was comprehensive enough to include the brook where the prophet himself was hiding. The drought did not exempt the righteous. It did not provide special meteorological zones of rainfall around the places where the prophets of God were living. The land was dry. And the brook Cherith, the specific provision that God had directed Elijah to, dried up along with everything else. Then the word of the Lord came to him, Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you. 1 Kings 17 verses 8-9, Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon. The home territory of Jezebel, the Phoenician region from which the queen who was persecuting the prophets of Israel had come, the cultural heartland of Baal worship. God was sending his prophet not to a safe Israelite territory but into the very region from which the primary threat to Israel's covenant life had originated. And the provision he had arranged there was not a wealthy patron or a military ally or a community of the faithful. A widow. Specifically a widow, the most economically vulnerable category of person in the ancient world. A widow in Sidon, a Gentile woman, outside the covenant people, in the territory of Baal. I have commanded a widow there to feed you. So he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, Bring me a little water in a vessel, that I may drink. And as she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. And she said, As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. And now I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. 1 Kings 17 verses 10-12. That we may eat it and die. The situation of the widow at Zarephath was the situation of the famine at its most personal and most devastating, a mother with one remaining handful of flour and one remaining measure of oil, gathering the last sticks to cook the last meal for herself and her son before they died. The drought that God had declared through Elijah, the drought that was demonstrating before all Israel that Baal did not control the rain, was killing people. Ordinary, vulnerable, non-ideological people who had no particular investment in the theological contest between the God of Israel and the storm deity of Canaan. A widow. Her son. A handful of flour. A little oil. And then death. And Elijah said to her, Do not fear. Go and do as you have said. But first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me, and afterward make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty, until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth. 1 Kings 17 verses 13-14, Do not fear. The command of God's messenger, delivered in every situation of impossible faith across the entire biblical narrative, do not fear. And then the instruction that required of the widow the most radical act of faith available to a woman in her situation. First make me a little cake and bring it to me. Before you make something for yourself and your son. Before you secure what remains of the provision for your own survival. Give first. To the prophet. To God. And then the promise, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty. And she went and did as Elijah said. And she and he and her household ate for many days. The jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. 1 Kings 17 verses 15 to 16, the jar did not run out. The jug did not become empty. Day after day, in the home of a Gentile widow in the Phoenician territory of Sidon, the miraculous provision continued, the handful of flour that should have been the last producing the next day's bread, and the next, and the next. The God whose word had stopped the rain was providing bread in the territory of Baal, through the faith of a widow who had given her last to the prophet of the God she barely knew, in the very region from which the threat to Israel's covenant life had come. The theological irony was as precise as the miracle was real. In Jezebel's home territory, through the faith of a Sidonian widow, the God of Israel was demonstrating his sovereignty over the provision of food and life in the same way he was demonstrating his sovereignty over the provision of rain. And then the son of the widow died. After these things the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became ill. And his illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. And she said to Elijah, "What have you against me, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son." 1 Kings 17 verses 17 to 18, "You have come to bring my sin to remembrance." The theology of the widow's grief was the theology of every human being who has ever faced catastrophic loss in the context of a new relationship with God, the sudden conviction that the divine attention drawn to her life by the presence of the prophet had also drawn divine attention to her failures, and that the death of her son was the consequence of that attention. The grief and the guilt were wound together in her accusation of Elijah. The man of God whose presence had saved her from starvation was now, in her grief, the man whose presence had brought the divine scrutiny that had killed her son. And Elijah said to her, "Give me your son." And he took him from her arms and carried him up to the upper chamber where he was lodging, and laid him on his own bed. And he cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I dwell, by killing her son?" Then he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this child's soul come into him again." And the Lord listened to the voice of Elijah. And the soul of the child came into him again, and he revived. 1 Kings 17 verses 19 to 22. The soul of the child came into him again. The first resurrection account in the Bible, the first recorded instance in Scripture of a dead person being brought back to life by the prayer of a prophet, happened not in Israel but in Sidon. Not for an Israelite child but for the son of a Gentile widow. Not in the context of the established religious life of the covenant people but in the home of a woman who had been outside the covenant and had been drawn into the orbit of the God of Israel through the radical hospitality she had shown to the prophet who asked for the last of her flour. The God who controlled the rain and the flour and the oil also controlled the boundary between life and death. And in restoring the son of the widow at Zarephath, he was demonstrating a sovereignty over death itself that no Baal cult had ever claimed and no Canaanite storm deity had ever demonstrated. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper chamber into the house and delivered him to his mother. And Elijah said, "See, your son lives." And the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." 1 Kings 17 verses 23 to 24, "Now I know." Not when the flour didn't run out, not when the oil didn't become empty, not even when she had first been saved from starvation by the miraculous provision, but now, with her dead son alive in her arms, the widow made her declaration. "Now I know that you are a man of God and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." The knowledge of God that she arrived at through the resurrection of her son was a knowledge that no amount of abstract theological argument or institutional religious instruction could have produced. It was the knowledge that comes from being personally encountered by the power and the mercy of the living God, from having the dead thing in your arms become alive again. Now I know. 3 years had passed. 3 years of drought across the land of Israel and beyond, 3 years during which the agricultural economy of the northern kingdom had been devastated, the streams had dried up, the pastures had turned to dust, the grain harvests had failed, and the political consequence of the meteorological catastrophe had been concentrated into the single burning question of where Elijah was and how to find him. Ahab had searched for the prophet of the drought across every nation and kingdom, making each one swear that they had not found him, conducting what amounted to an international manhunt for the man who had stood before the king and declared that the rain would stop. 1 Kings 18 verse 10, the prophet was nowhere. And the drought continued. After many days the word of the Lord came to Elijah, in the 3rd year, saying, Go, show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth. 1 Kings 18 verse 1, Go, show yourself. The period of hiddenness was over. The time of provision by ravens at the brook Cherith and by a widow's miraculous flour and oil in Zarephath was complete. The moment had arrived for which the 3 years of drought had been the preparation, the confrontation that would answer before all Israel the question that the entire drought had been raising. Who is God? Who controls the rain? The answer to that question would be given not in a theological lecture or a prophetic declaration but in a demonstration, a direct, public, empirical, impossible to deny demonstration that would take place on the top of Mount Carmel with 450 prophets of Baal on one side and Elijah alone on the other. So Elijah went to show himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria. And Ahab called Obadiah, who was over the household. Now Obadiah feared the Lord greatly, and when Jezebel cut off the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by 50s in a cave and fed them with bread and water. 1 Kings 18 verses 2-4, Obadiah. The steward of Ahab's household, the man whose position placed him at the center of the administration of the most Baal-devoted royal court in Israel's history, who secretly feared the Lord greatly. The coexistence of genuine covenant faithfulness and the necessity of serving a Baal-worshipping king was not comfortable or simple, but it was real. And Obadiah had used his position of domestic authority not to advance the interests of Baal but to secretly preserve the lives of 100 prophets of the Lord who would otherwise have been eliminated by Jezebel's systematic persecution. He had fed them and hidden them at personal risk, the steward of Ahab's house secretly running an underground network of prophetic preservation in the caves while his master was searching the nations for the prophet of the drought. When Obadiah encountered Elijah on the road, his response communicated the full weight of what the 3 years of drought and the royal manhunt had done to the atmosphere of fear in the kingdom. He fell on his face and said, Is it you, my lord Elijah? 1 Kings 18 verse 7, And Elijah said to him, It is I. Go tell your lord, behold, Elijah is here. And Obadiah's response revealed the depth of his fear, As the Lord your God lives, there is no nation or kingdom where my Lord has not sent to seek you. And now you say, Go tell your Lord, Elijah is here. And as soon as I have gone from you, the Spirit of the Lord will carry you I know not where. And so, when I come and tell Ahab and he cannot find you, he will kill me. 1 Kings 18 verses 10-12, the fear was real and the calculation was understandable. The man who brought Ahab the news that Elijah had been found, only for Elijah to have disappeared again before Ahab arrived, was the man who would pay with his life for the false alarm. Obadiah had survived the Baal-saturated court of Ahab by careful navigation of extraordinary danger, and he was not eager to place himself in the direct line of the royal fury. But Elijah said, As the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, I will surely show myself to him today. 1 Kings 18 verse 15, As the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand. The same oath with which Elijah had declared the drought before Ahab 3 years earlier. The same theological grounding, standing before the living God, speaking from that standing to earthly powers. I will surely show myself to him today. The commitment was absolute and the oath was the most binding available. And Obadiah went and told Ahab. And Ahab went to meet Elijah. And when Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, Is it you, you troubler of Israel? 1 Kings 18 verse 17, You troubler of Israel. The accusation communicated Ahab's understanding of the situation, or rather, his misunderstanding of it. In Ahab's framing, the trouble that had fallen on Israel was the fault of the man who had declared the drought, not the king whose covenant violations had created the conditions for divine judgment. The troubler was the prophet, not the apostate king. The cause of Israel's suffering was the man who had named the problem, not the man whose choices had created it. It was the ancient and persistent human response to prophetic judgment, blame the messenger for the message, call the one who names the sin the troubler rather than examining the sin that produced the trouble. And Elijah answered, I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. 1 Kings 18 verse 18, you have troubled Israel. You and your father's house. Because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. The clarity and the directness of Elijah's counter-accusation was the clarity of a man who had spent 3 years in hiddenness being sustained by God in the most dramatic possible ways, by ravens and by miracle flour and by the resurrection of a dead child, and who emerged from those 3 years with his prophetic certainty undiminished and his willingness to speak the truth to power uncompromised. The troubler of Israel was not Elijah. It was the covenant violation. It was the Baals. It was the abandonment of the Lord that had produced the drought as the divine response. Now therefore send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table. 1 Kings 18 verse 19, the confrontation Elijah was proposing was not a private theological debate. It was a public demonstration on the largest possible scale, all Israel, all the prophets of Baal, Mount Carmel. The stage would be the sacred mountain overlooking the Jezreel Valley, visible for miles in every direction, a site associated in the ancient world with the divine presence and with the kinds of cosmic transactions that human beings instinctively gathered on high places to witness and participate in. The audience would be the entire nation. The participants would be 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah on one side and Elijah alone on the other. The question would be the question that the 3 years of drought had been asking, who is God? And the answer would be given in fire. So Ahab sent to all the people of Israel and gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. And the people did not answer him a word. 1 Kings 18 verses 20 to 21, How long will you go limping between two different opinions? The image Elijah used, the limping between two opinions, the halting between two positions, communicated the spiritual condition of Israel at that moment with devastating precision. The people had not made a clean break with the God of Israel and fully embraced Baal. Nor had they maintained their covenant faithfulness and rejected the Baal cult entirely. They were limping, moving in both directions simultaneously, trying to maintain some relationship with the covenant God while also participating in the Baal worship that royal power and cultural pressure and the sophisticated religious infrastructure of Jezebel's court were making normative. The compromise that is not quite apostasy and not quite faithfulness. The spiritual position that tries to keep all options open and in doing so honors neither. How long will you go limping between two different opinions? The people did not answer him a word. The silence of the assembly was the silence of a people who knew, at some level, that the question being asked required a commitment they were not yet ready to make. The answer to how long will you go limping was not a simple one, it required an honest reckoning with the choices they had been making and the direction those choices had been taking them. And the silence was the silence of people in whom the capacity for that honest reckoning had been partially suppressed by years of accommodation to the culture of Baal worship and by the social and political pressure of living under a king whose household was fully invested in the Baal cult. They did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, Even I only am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Let 2 bulls be given to us, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves and cut it in pieces and lay it on the wood but put no fire to it, and I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood and put no fire to it. And you call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he is God. And all the people answered, It is well spoken. 1 Kings 18 verses 22 to 24, The God who answers by fire, he is God. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its theological precision. The test would exploit the specific and defining claim of Baal worship. Baal was the storm god, the one associated with lightning and fire from heaven, the one whose divine power expressed itself in exactly the kind of celestial fire that the test required. If there was any deity in the entire Canaanite pantheon who should have been able to answer this test, it was Baal. The test was designed to give Baal every possible advantage. And the one who proposed it was doing so with the complete confidence of a man who knew exactly which God was going to answer. And Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose for yourselves one bull and prepare it first, for you are many, and call upon the name of your God, but put no fire to it." 1 Kings 18 verse 25, So they took the bull that was given them, and they prepared it and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they limped around the altar that they had made. 1 Kings 18 verse 26, They limped around the altar. The same word translated limping in Elijah's question to the people, "How long will you go limping?" was now being used to describe the ritual dance of the prophets of Baal around the altar. The Israel that was limping between two opinions was watching the prophets of the deity they had been trying to serve limping around an altar that their prayers could not ignite. The image was not incidental. It was the divine commentary on the spiritual condition of a nation that had been trying to navigate between the God of covenant and the storm deity of the Canaanites, the limping of compromise producing the limping of futile ritual. And at noon Elijah mocked them, saying, "Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened." 1 Kings 18 verse 27, The mockery of Elijah was the prophetic genre of the ridicule of idols, the demonstration by satirical deconstruction that the claims of false deity, when taken seriously and examined honestly, collapse into absurdity. Musing. Relieving himself. On a journey. Asleep. The catalogue of reasons why an apparently present deity might be failing to respond was the catalogue of the limitations of a creature, the limitations of something that has needs, that requires rest, that can be elsewhere, that must be awakened. The God of Israel had no such limitations. He neither slumbers nor sleeps. Psalm 121 verse 4, The mockery was not cruelty. It was truth, the truth about the nature of the thing the prophets of Baal were calling upon, the truth that the people of Israel needed to hear from someone who was not afraid to say it. And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances, until the blood gushed out upon them. And as midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation, but there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention. 1 Kings 18 verses 28 to 29, No voice. No answer. No one paid attention. The threefold statement of divine non-response to the desperate, self-wounding, hours-long prayers of 850 prophets was the theological verdict on Baal worship delivered not in words but in the silence of a God who was not there and could not answer because he did not exist. The entire religious infrastructure of Jezebel's court, the prophets, the temples, the altars, the systematic persecution of the Lord's prophets, the institutional investment in the claim that Baal controlled the rain, confronted the simple test of a fire from heaven and produced nothing. No voice. No answer. No one paid attention. And then Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." And all the people came near to him. And he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, "Israel shall be your name." And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. And he made a trench about the altar, as great as would contain 2 seahs of seed. And he put the wood in order and cut the bull in pieces and laid it on the wood. And he said, "Fill 4 jars with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood." And he said, "Do it a second time." And they did it a second time. And he said, "Do it a third time." And they did it a third time. And the water ran around the altar and filled the trench also with water. 1 Kings 18 verses 30 to 35. 12 stones. The number was deliberate and theologically loaded, one for each tribe of the sons of Jacob, the entire covenant people represented in the altar that Elijah was repairing. The altar of the Lord that had been thrown down, the physical symbol of the covenant worship that Jezebel's campaign had been dismantling, was being rebuilt with stones that represented the wholeness of Israel as the covenant people of the God of Israel. And then the water. 4 jars. 3 times. 12 jars of water poured over the altar and the sacrifice and the wood until the trench around the altar was full. The water was the most direct possible statement about what was at stake. In the 3rd year of a drought that Elijah had declared in the name of the God who controlled the rain, water was being deliberately, wastefully, extravagantly poured over the sacrifice that was about to be consumed by fire from heaven. The God who had stopped the rain for 3 years had more water available to waste on a demonstration of his power than 850 prophets of Baal could produce in response to their most desperate prayers. And at the time of the offering of the oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back." 1 Kings 18 verses 36 to 37. Let it be known this day that you are God in Israel. The prayer of Elijah at Mount Carmel was not a prayer for personal vindication or for the defeat of his enemies. It was a prayer for the knowledge of God, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. The entire purpose of the demonstration was the same as the entire purpose of the drought, not the punishment of the wicked for its own sake but the restoration of the knowledge of God to a people who had lost it, the turning back of hearts that had been turned away, the answer to the question that every element of the Mount Carmel confrontation had been designed to force into the open. Let this people know that you are God. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." 1 Kings 18 verses 38 to 39. The fire fell. Not a gradual warming of the wood. Not a smoldering that could be attributed to natural causes. Fire fell, from heaven, instantly, completely, consuming not only the sacrifice and the wood but the stones of the altar and the dust and the water in the trench. The impossible totality of the consumption was the divine signature, the declaration in fire that admitted of no naturalistic explanation, that could not be attributed to coincidence or fraud or the natural combustion of waterlogged wood, that answered the question how long will you go limping between two different opinions with a celestial statement that made any further limping impossible for anyone who had been present on Mount Carmel that day. The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. The confession of all the people, falling on their faces before the altar that Elijah had rebuilt with 12 stones, was the confession that the 3 years of drought and the hours of Baal's prophets calling in vain and the 12 jars of water and the prayer of one prophet alone had been designed to produce. The Lord, He is God. The fire had fallen. The people had confessed. The 450 prophets of Baal, the religious infrastructure of Jezebel's campaign to replace the worship of the God of Israel with the cult of the Canaanite storm deity, had been seized at Elijah's command and brought down to the brook Kishon and killed there. 1 Kings 18 verse 40, the theological verdict of Mount Carmel had been ratified in the most decisive possible way. And then Elijah said to Ahab, "Go up, eat and drink, for there is a sound of the rushing of rain." 1 Kings 18 verse 41. A sound of the rushing of rain. Not the sight of clouds on the horizon. Not the feel of moisture in the air. Not any external evidence that what Elijah was announcing was approaching. The sound of the rain in the spirit of the prophet before the rain was visible in the sky. And Elijah went up to the top of Mount Carmel and bowed himself down on the earth and put his face between his knees. 1 Kings 18 verse 42, he bowed himself down and put his face between his knees. The prophet who had stood before the 850 prophets of Baal with the full public confidence of a man whose God was about to demonstrate his sovereignty in fire was now, alone on the top of the mountain with the demonstration complete, in the posture of intense and concentrated prayer. The same man. The same faith. But now the posture was not the prophetic declaration to the crowd but the intimate, physical, face between the knees wrestling of a man in prayer. And he said to his servant, "Go up now, look toward the sea." And he went up and looked and said, "There is nothing." And he said, "Go again, 7 times." And at the 7th time he said, behold, a small cloud like a man's hand is rising from the sea. And he said, Go up, say to Ahab, Prepare your chariot and go down, lest the rain stop you. And in a little while the heavens grew black with clouds and wind, and there was a great rain. And Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. 1 Kings 18 verses 43-45. 7 times. The servant went 7 times to look toward the sea before the evidence appeared, and when it appeared not as a storm front covering the horizon but as a small cloud like a man's hand rising from the sea. The tiniest possible indication. The smallest possible beginning. And Elijah, whose prayer had persisted through 6 reports of nothing, received the 7th report, a small cloud like a man's hand, as sufficient evidence to send a warning to Ahab. The faith of the prophet was not the faith of someone who waited for massive visible confirmation before believing. It was the faith of someone who persisted through 6 nothings and received the hand-sized cloud as the beginning of the fulfillment. The rain that had been stopped for 3 years by the word of the Lord came back at the prayer of the prophet who had declared it stopped, and came back in a great rain, the heavens growing black with clouds and wind, the meteorological reversal as comprehensive and unmistakable as the drought had been. And the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he gathered up his garment and ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. 1 Kings 18 verse 46, he ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. The supernatural empowerment that ran Elijah faster than Ahab's chariot, the hand of the Lord enabling a physical feat that exceeded ordinary human capability, was the final physical demonstration on this extraordinary day of who the power behind Elijah was. The prophet who had stood alone against 850 was now running ahead of the king's chariot in the rain that he had prayed down from the sky, arriving at the entrance of Jezreel before the king who rode behind him. The hand of the Lord was on Elijah. But then, something happened that stands as one of the most startling and most humanly recognizable moments in the entire biblical narrative. The man who had called down fire from heaven, who had outrun a chariot in the power of God, who had stood alone on Mount Carmel and confronted the entire religious establishment of the Baal cult with the composure of someone whose God was about to demonstrate his sovereignty before the whole nation, that man received a message from Jezebel. And he was afraid. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, So may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. Then he was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers. 1 Kings 19 verses 1-4. It is enough. The prophet who had called down fire from heaven was sitting under a broom tree in the wilderness asking to die. The man before whom 850 prophets had been silenced was running for his life from the message of one woman. The contrast between the Mount Carmel Elijah and the broom tree Elijah is so stark, so apparently contradictory, so theologically unsettling that readers across centuries have found it difficult to reconcile. The same person. The same faith. The same God. And yet, the fear, the flight, the exhaustion, the despair, the prayer for death. It is enough. I am no better than my fathers. The statement of a man who has given everything, who has been sustained through 3 years of hiddenness and dramatic provision and the resurrection of a dead child and the fire of Mount Carmel and the rain and the supernatural run, and who, in the aftermath of all of it, when the threat of one queen's wrath arrived at his door, collapsed into the most total exhaustion and despair that the biblical narrative records for any prophet. The human reality of Elijah under the broom tree is perhaps the most important thing in his entire story, not because despair is admirable or because the collapse of prophetic courage is to be emulated, but because the way God responded to it reveals more about the character of the God Elijah served than almost anything else in the narrative. God did not rebuke him. Did not send another prophetic word demanding that he get up and get back to work. Did not remind him of what had just been accomplished on Mount Carmel and demand an appropriate response of sustained triumph. God sent an angel. And the angel touched him and said, Arise and eat. 1 Kings 19 verse 5. Arise and eat. Not arise and prophesy. Not arise and rebuke Jezebel. Not arise and demonstrate the faith that sent fire from heaven. Arise and eat. The response of the God of the universe to a broken, exhausted, despairing prophet hiding under a broom tree was to touch him and offer him food. And behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and lay down again. 1 Kings 19 verse 6, he ate and lay down again. The provision was received and the exhaustion was still there, and the angel let him sleep again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. 1 Kings 19 verse 7. The journey is too great for you. The acknowledgement of the divine messenger that the demand being placed on this prophet was genuinely demanding, that the journey ahead was genuinely beyond ordinary human capacity, that the exhaustion under the broom tree was not a spiritual failure requiring rebuke but a human reality requiring provision. Arise and eat. For the journey is too great for you. And he arose and ate and drank, and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. 1 Kings 19 verse 8, 40 days and 40 nights. The same period of Israel's wilderness journey compressed into the journey of a single prophet. The same number of days that Moses had spent on the mountain receiving the law. The food provided by the angel sustained Elijah for 40 days and 40 nights, the supernatural provision calibrated precisely to the supernatural journey, the divine nourishment exactly adequate to what the divine commission required. And there he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, What are you doing here, Elijah? 1 Kings 19 verse 9, What are you doing here, Elijah? The question of God to his prophet at the cave on Horeb was not primarily a rebuke, though it carried within it a gentle challenge to the displacement of Elijah from the field of his prophetic calling. It was an invitation to honest speech, an opening for Elijah to say what he was actually experiencing, to articulate what had brought him 40 days into the wilderness to a cave on the mountain of God. He said, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. 1 Kings 19 verse 10, I have been very jealous for the Lord. The self-presentation of Elijah was the self-presentation of a man whose sense of his own faithfulness had become inseparable from his sense of his own isolation. He had been jealous for God, had given everything, had confronted Ahab, had stood on Mount Carmel, had called down fire and prayed down rain. And the result was not the national repentance and covenant renewal he might have expected. The result was Jezebel's death threat and the ongoing apostasy of Israel. I, even I only, am left. The conviction of total isolation, of being the last faithful person in a nation that had abandoned the covenant, was the specific form that Elijah's despair had taken. Not merely exhaustion. Not merely fear. The loneliness of someone who believes they are completely alone in the thing they are most committed to. And he said, Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire the sound of a low whisper. 1 Kings 19 verses 11 to 12, the sound of a low whisper. The translation renders differently in various versions, still small voice, gentle blowing, the sound of sheer silence, but all of them communicating the same theological reality. The God who had just demonstrated his presence in the most spectacular possible way on Mount Carmel, in fire that consumed stones and water, in rain that broke a 3-year drought, in the supernatural empowerment that ran his prophet before a chariot, was now communicating with Elijah in the opposite register entirely. Wind. Earthquake. Fire. And then, the whisper. The Lord was not in the wind. The Lord was not in the earthquake. The Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the quiet voice. The theological movement from Mount Carmel to Horeb was the movement from the spectacular to the intimate, from the public, visible, empirically demonstrable display of divine power before all Israel to the private, personal, almost inaudible communication of the divine presence to one exhausted prophet in a cave. Both were real expressions of who God was. Both were authentic modes of divine self-disclosure. But the whisper after the fire was the mode of communication that the isolated, despairing, "I am the only one left" Elijah most needed, the demonstration that the God who could fill the sky with fire could also speak in the still small voice that only the quieted, listening soul could hear. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" 1 Kings 19 verse 13, the same question. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Asked before the wind and the earthquake and the fire, and asked again after them, in the whisper. The question was not asking for information, God knew what Elijah was doing there. It was asking for self-disclosure, for the prophet to give words to the interior reality that had driven him 40 days into the wilderness to a cave on the mountain of God. And Elijah gave the same answer. He said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." 1 Kings 19 verse 14. The same words. The same conviction. The wind and the earthquake and the fire had not changed what Elijah believed about his situation. The whisper that followed them had not resolved the theological problem he was articulating. He was still the last one. Still the only faithful one. Still alone. And God, in his response, did not dispute the claim about Elijah's faithfulness or challenge the reality of the persecution or suggest that Elijah's sense of isolation was imaginary. He simply told him 3 things to do, and added one piece of information that shattered the foundation of the "I am the only one" conviction entirely. "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. And Jehu the son of Nimshi you shall anoint to be king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah you shall anoint to be prophet in your place." 1 Kings 19 verses 15 to 16, go. 3 anointings. 3 appointments. The divine response to Elijah's exhaustion and isolation and prayer for death was not a sabbatical or a therapy session or an extended period of rest and recovery. It was a commission. A specific, named, action-oriented commission with 3 clear tasks. Go. Anoint Hazael. Anoint Jehu. Anoint Elisha. The God who had provided food and sleep and the whisper after the fire was also the God who had work that needed to be done, and the prophet under the broom tree was still the prophet through whom that work would be accomplished. And then the piece of information that changed everything Elijah believed about his situation. "Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." 1 Kings 19 verse 18, 7,000. The man who had said "I, even I only, am left" was told that there were 7,000 others. 7,000 people in Israel who had not bowed to Baal. 7,000 people who had maintained their covenant faithfulness through the years of Jezebel's persecution and Ahab's religious politics. 7,000 people who existed outside the awareness of the prophet who believed himself to be completely alone. The isolation that had driven Elijah to the broom tree and the cave and the prayer for death was real. He genuinely did not know about the 7,000. But the isolation was not the reality. The reality was 7,000 faithful ones, hidden in Israel, known to God, maintained by the God who preserves his people even when his prophets cannot see them. "I have left 7,000 in Israel." The sovereignty of the preservation, God had left them, God had maintained them, God had kept their knees from bowing and their mouths from kissing while the entire institutional religious and political apparatus of the kingdom had been devoted to Baal worship. The 7,000 were not the product of Elijah's ministry or any other human effort, They were the remnant that the God of the covenant had preserved in the midst of the apostasy, the hidden faithful whose existence was known to God even when it was invisible to the prophet who thought he was the only one left. The revelation of the 7,000 to Elijah was the revelation that the God he served was working on a much larger canvas than the one Elijah could see from his cave on Horeb. That the story of covenant faithfulness in Israel was not the story of one exhausted prophet alone against a nation of apostates. That the preservation of the covenant community was not dependent on the visibility or the success of any single prophetic ministry. That God had been working quietly, hidden from the prophet's awareness, maintaining the faithfulness of 7,000 people through all the years of Elijah's ministry and all the years of the drought and all the drama of Mount Carmel and all the running from Jezebel's threat. 7,000. Hidden. Preserved. Known to God. So Elijah departed from there and found Elisha the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen in front of him, and he was with the 12th. Elijah passed by him and cast his cloak upon him. 1 Kings 19 verse 19, the casting of the cloak was the prophetic act of commissioning, the physical, symbolic transfer of prophetic identity and calling from one person to another. Elisha, plowing his father's field with 12 yoke of oxen, was in the middle of entirely ordinary agricultural labor when the most dramatic prophetic commissioning in the Old Testament arrived at his location in the form of a traveling prophet casting a cloak over his shoulders. And Elisha left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, "Let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you." 1 Kings 19 verse 20, and he returned from following him and took the yoke of oxen and sacrificed them and boiled their flesh with the yokes of the oxen and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he arose and went after Elijah and assisted him. 1 Kings 19 verse 21. Elisha burned the yokes. He killed the oxen. He fed the people. And then he followed Elijah. The burning of the yokes, the agricultural tools of his previous life and his family's livelihood, was the physical declaration that there would be no going back, no returning to the previous life, no using the oxen as an excuse to leave the prophetic calling if the prophetic calling became too costly. He had burned the bridges. He had closed the exits. He followed Elijah. And in following Elijah, he was beginning the apprenticeship that would eventually produce a prophet whose ministry would exceed even Elijah's, whose miracles would be more numerous, whose compassion would be more consistently pastoral, whose life would be the human instrument through which God's healing power would be demonstrated with even greater frequency and even greater scope than in the ministry of the prophet who had called fire from heaven and rain from a 3-year drought. The prophet who had asked to die under a broom tree had been given not death but a successor. The man who had said "I, even I only, am left" had been told about 7,000 and had been given Elisha. The commission that followed the cave and the whisper and the revelation of the 7,000 was the commission that would produce the most faithful prophetic succession in the Old Testament, and the extraordinary ending of Elijah's life that would leave no grave to mark because the prophet who had prayed for death would be taken to heaven without dying at all. The years that followed the cave at Horeb were the years in which the commission God had given Elijah at the mountain was being executed, not all at once, not in the clean sequential order of a completed checklist, but in a complicated, sometimes delayed, sometimes surprising way that divine commissions always unfold when they are being worked out through the ordinary, and sometimes extraordinary, fabric of historical events. The anointing of Elisha had already been accomplished in the cloak casting at the field of Abel Meholah. The anointings of Hazael and Jehu would be accomplished through Elisha after Elijah's departure. But before the departure came, before the whirlwind and the chariot of fire and the extraordinary exit that would make Elijah the only prophet in the Old Testament taken to heaven alive, there was one more confrontation. One more moment in which the voice of the prophet who had stood before the living God was required to speak a word of judgment that no one else in Israel would speak to the person who needed to hear it. Ahab wanted a vineyard. It belonged to a man named Naboth the Jezreelite, and it was located adjacent to the palace in Jezreel, good land, desirable land, the kind of property that a king could see from his window and want for a kitchen garden. And Ahab spoke to Naboth, saying, "Give me your vineyard, that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it is near my house, and I will give you a better vineyard for it, or if it seems good to you, I will give you its value in money." 1 Kings 21 verse 2, the offer was reasonable by the standards of commercial real estate transactions. A fair exchange. A better vineyard. Or the monetary equivalent. The king was not demanding confiscation, he was offering compensation. But Naboth said to Ahab, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." 1 Kings 21 verse 3, "The Lord forbid." Naboth's refusal was not stubbornness or irrational attachment to a piece of property. It was covenant faithfulness, the specific, named, theologically grounded refusal rooted in the Mosaic law's provision for the permanent family inheritance in the Promised Land. The land was not merely real estate. It was covenant inheritance, the physical expression of a family's place in the Promised Land, the land that God had given to Israel and that was not to be permanently alienated from the family to whom it had been assigned. Leviticus 25 verses 23 to 28, Numbers 36:7, Naboth was not being difficult. He was honoring a specific divine provision. "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." And Ahab went into his house vexed and sullen because of what Naboth the Jezreelite had said to him, for he had said, "I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers." And he lay down on his bed and turned away his face and would not eat bread. 1 Kings 21 verse 4, the king of Israel, the most powerful man in the northern kingdom, was sulking on his bed because a farmer had said no. The image communicates the infantile quality of unchecked power that has never learned to accept a boundary, the petulance of someone for whom the word no has been so rare in the exercise of royal authority that a single legitimate no from a covenant-faithful farmer produces a childlike withdrawal and refusal to eat. And Jezebel his wife came to him and said to him, "Why is your spirit so vexed that you eat no food?" And he said to her, "Because I spoke to Naboth the Jezreelite and said to him, 'Give me your vineyard for money, or else if it please you, I will give you another vineyard for it.' And he answered, 'I will not give you my vineyard.' And Jezebel his wife said to him, 'Do you now govern Israel? Arise and eat bread and let your heart be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite.' 1 Kings 21 verses 5 to 7, "Do you now govern Israel?" The rhetorical question of Jezebel communicated everything about the difference between Ahab's understanding of power and Jezebel's. Ahab, for all his covenant violations and his accommodation of Jezebel's Baal campaign, still operated within a residual framework of Israelite tradition in which even a king could not simply take what the law protected. Jezebel had no such framework. She was a Phoenician queen whose understanding of royal power was the understanding of absolute sovereignty. The king's will was the law, and what the king wanted the king got, and any obstacle to the fulfillment of the royal will was simply a problem to be removed by whatever means were available. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with his seal and sent the letters to the elders and the leaders who lived with Naboth in his city. And she wrote in the letters, "Proclaim a fast and set Naboth at the head of the people. And set 2 worthless men opposite him and let them bring a charge against him, saying, 'You have cursed God and the king. Then take him out and stone him to death.'" 1 Kings 21 verses 8 to 10, the mechanism of Naboth's murder was the mechanism of the false legal process, the use of the covenant community's own structures of justice and the covenant law's requirements for witnesses and public proceedings to execute a judicial murder. 2 worthless men. 2 false witnesses. The charge of blasphemy, "You have cursed God and the king," which carried the death penalty and the forfeiture of property. The elders and leaders of Jezreel, who ought to have been the guardians of the community's covenant integrity, complied with the royal letters. And Naboth was killed. And as soon as Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned and was dead, Jezebel said to Ahab, "Arise, take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, which he refused to give you for money, for Naboth is not alive, but dead." 1 Kings 21 verse 15, "Arise, take possession." The vineyard that the covenant law had protected, the inheritance of a man's fathers, the piece of the promised land that the Mosaic provision had made essentially inalienable, was now available for the taking because the man who had honored the law by refusing to sell it had been murdered by the queen through the perversion of the community's own legal processes. And Ahab arose to go down to the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, to take possession of it. 1 Kings 21 verse 16. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, Arise, go down to meet Ahab king of Israel, who is in Samaria. Behold, he is in the vineyard of Naboth, where he has gone to take possession. And you shall say to him, Thus says the Lord, Have you killed and also taken possession? And you shall say to him, Thus says the Lord, In the place where dogs licked up the blood of Naboth shall dogs lick your blood, even yours. 1 Kings 21 verses 17 to 19, Go down to meet Ahab. The word of the Lord to Elijah was not a word of encouragement or of comfort. It was the word of judgment, the specific, personal, named judgment on the specific, personal, named sin of a king who had allowed his wife to murder a man for his vineyard and then gone to take possession of the murdered man's property. The prophetic commission that had followed the cave at Horeb and the whisper and the revelation of the 7,000 was being fulfilled not in the grand, Mount Carmel style of the fire demonstration but in the intimate and devastating confrontation of a prophet arriving at a vineyard to tell a king that the blood he had shed would be shed in the same place. And Ahab said to Elijah, Have you found me, O my enemy? He said, I have found you, because you have sold yourself to do what is evil in the sight of the Lord. 1 Kings 21 verse 20, Have you found me, O my enemy? The recognition between Ahab and Elijah, the immediate, resigned acknowledgement by the king that the appearance of this prophet meant a word of judgment was coming, communicated the relationship between the two men across the years of their prophetic royal conflict. Ahab knew what Elijah's presence meant. He knew that the man he called his enemy was the man who spoke the truth that his other advisers would not speak. And he called him enemy precisely because the truth Elijah spoke was the truth that Ahab most needed to hear and most did not want to. Because you have sold yourself to do what is evil in the sight of the Lord. The charge against Ahab was precise, not merely that evil had been done, but that Ahab had sold himself to do it. The language of self-selling communicated the voluntary, chosen, self-subordinating nature of Ahab's relationship to the evil his reign had produced. He had not been forced into it. He had sold himself, placed himself willingly in the service of the agenda that Jezebel represented, allowing his royal authority to be the instrument of her Baal campaign and now of her judicial murder, using the seal of his kingship to authorize letters that he knew would produce Naboth's death. He had sold himself. And the judgment that followed the self-selling was proportioned to the crime with the precision that characterizes divine justice at its most exact. And then there was a response that the reader does not expect. When Ahab heard those words, he tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his flesh and fasted and lay in sackcloth and went about dejectedly. And the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, Have you seen how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he has humbled himself before me, I will not bring the disaster in his days. But in his son's days I will bring the disaster upon his house. 1 Kings 21 verses 27 to 29. Ahab humbled himself. The king who had sulked on his bed because Naboth would not sell him a vineyard, the king who had called Elijah his enemy, the king who had allowed his wife to murder a faithful man for his property, that king heard the word of judgment and tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and fasted. The humility was real enough to be recognized by God and to produce a modification of the timing of the judgment, not its cancellation, but its deferment. The disaster would come. But not in Ahab's days. In his son's days. The mercy that operated even within the framework of divine judgment, the God who responds to even partial, incomplete, imperfect humility with a measured compassion that is itself the expression of the steadfast love that endures forever, was visible even in the judgment on Israel's most comprehensively evil king. The final years of Ahab's reign produced one more confrontation between the word of the Lord and the political and military decisions of the northern kingdom, and one more demonstration of the divine commitment to the truth regardless of whether the truth was welcome. Ahab wanted to go to war against Aram to recover Ramoth-Gilead. He gathered his prophets, 400 of them, and they all said, Go up, for the Lord will give it into the hand of the king. 1 Kings 22 verse 6, 400 prophets. All saying the same thing. All telling the king what the king wanted to hear. The institutional religious apparatus of the court producing uniform prophetic endorsement of the royal military agenda. But Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah who was allied with Ahab, asked, "Is there not here another prophet of the Lord of whom we may inquire?" 1 Kings 22 verse 7, "Is there not another prophet?" The question communicated an instinctive unease with the unanimity, an intuition that 400 prophets all saying exactly what the king wanted to hear was perhaps not the most reliable source of genuine divine guidance. And Ahab answered, "There is yet one man by whom we may inquire of the Lord, Micaiah the son of Imlah, but I hate him, for he never prophesies good concerning me, but evil." 1 Kings 22 verse 8. I hate him, for he never prophesies good concerning me. The royal criterion for prophetic authenticity, a prophet who always prophesies good for the king is a reliable prophet, a prophet who prophesies evil is one to be hated. The complete inversion of the actual criterion for prophetic authenticity, which was not whether the word confirmed the king's desires but whether the word was true. And when Micaiah was brought and pressed to speak, having initially given an ironic echo of the 400's message that Ahab immediately recognized as false, he said to Ahab, "Therefore hear the word of the Lord, I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, Who will entice Ahab, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead?" And one said one thing, and another said another. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, "I will entice him." And the Lord said to him, "By what means?" And he said, "I will go out and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets." And he said, "You are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so." 1 Kings 22 verses 19 to 22. The vision of Micaiah communicated the full theological context of the 400's unanimously positive prophecy, not merely human flattery or institutional self-interest, but a divinely permitted spiritual deception operating through the prophets who were telling Ahab what he wanted to hear, enabling the outcome that divine judgment had determined for the king who had sold himself to do evil. And Ahab went to war at Ramoth Gilead. And a man drew his bow at random and struck the king of Israel between the scale armor and the breastplate. And the king said to the driver of his chariot, "Turn around and carry me out of the battle, for I am wounded." 1 Kings 22 verse 34. The arrow shot at random. Not aimed at Ahab specifically. Not the result of a sniper targeting the king with deliberate precision. An arrow drawn at random in the chaos of battle, and it found the specific gap between the scale armor and the breastplate of the king who had sold himself to do evil in the sight of the Lord. And the king was propped up in his chariot facing the Syrians until the evening, and then at sunset he died. And the blood from the wound flowed into the bottom of the chariot. And the chariot was washed by the pool of Samaria, and the dogs licked up his blood, and the prostitutes washed themselves in it, according to the word of the Lord that he had spoken. 1 Kings 22 verses 35 to 38. The dogs licked up his blood, according to the word of the Lord that he had spoken. The judgment that Elijah had delivered in the vineyard of Naboth, "In the place where dogs licked up the blood of Naboth shall dogs lick your blood," was fulfilled in the pool of Samaria where the chariot that carried Ahab's body was washed. The prophetic word that had seemed, in the moment of its delivery, like the kind of dramatic prophetic condemnation that kings routinely survived, was fulfilled. Exactly as God had spoken it. As Elijah had carried it. And the account of Elijah's ministry was not yet complete. Because the prophet who had called down fire from heaven and prayed down rain and raised a dead child and confronted the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel and received the whisper at Horeb and stood in the vineyard of Naboth and delivered the judgment on Ahab, that prophet was approaching the most extraordinary moment of his extraordinary life. Not the fire from heaven. Not the whirlwind of Horeb. Not the miraculous provisions of ravens and widow's flour. Something beyond all of those. Something that only one other human being in all of biblical history had experienced. The moment when a man of God would leave the surface of the earth without dying. The moment when the boundary between this world and the next would open for Elijah as it had opened for Enoch, and the prophet would go through it alive. Now when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven by a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. 2 Kings 2 verse 1, the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven. The sentence is stated at the very beginning of the account as a fact, not a possibility, not a rumor, not a theological speculation about what might happen to a prophet of extraordinary faithfulness. A fact. The Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven by a whirlwind. The sovereign divine intention was clear and already determined, and the narrative that follows is the account of how that intention was executed, the final journey of the prophet who would not die, the last day of a life that would not end in the ordinary way that every other human life since Adam had ended. And Elijah said to Elisha, "Please stay here, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. 2 Kings 2 verse 2, "I will not leave you." The commitment of Elisha to his teacher in the final hours of Elijah's earthly life was the commitment of a man who understood that something of unique and unrepeatable significance was about to happen and who refused to be anywhere other than present for it. He had followed Elijah from the field at Abel-Meholah. He had burned the yokes and killed the oxen and fed the people and then gone after Elijah and served him. And in the final day he was not going to be sent away. "I will not leave you." The covenant fidelity of the disciple to his teacher on the day of the teacher's departure had the same character as Ruth's fidelity to Naomi on the road from Moab, a clinging, a refusing to release, a determination to remain present through whatever was coming regardless of the personal cost or the difficulty of the journey. And the sons of the prophets who were at Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, "Do you know that today the Lord will take away your master from over you?" And he said, "Yes, I know it. Be silent." 2 Kings 2 verse 3, "Yes, I know it. Be silent." The knowledge that this was the final day was not limited to Elisha, the communities of prophets at Bethel and at Jericho also knew it. The word had reached the prophetic communities that the day of Elijah's departure had arrived. And Elisha's response to their announcement was not grief or denial or the desire to discuss what was coming. Be silent. The silence he demanded was the silence of a man who was holding something precious and did not want the solemnity of the moment disturbed by conversation about what he already knew and had already decided how to face. Then Elijah said to him, "Elisha, please stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Jericho." But he said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." And they came to Jericho. 2 Kings 2 verse 4, the second refusal. The same offer of release, "Stay here, you do not need to come further," and the same refusal. "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." 3 times Elijah would offer Elisha the opportunity to stop, at Gilgal, at Bethel, at Jericho, and 3 times Elisha would refuse. The triple refusal communicated something beyond simple emotional loyalty. It communicated the theological seriousness of what Elisha understood was at stake, that what was about to happen was worth following all the way to the banks of the Jordan, worth being present for regardless of what Elijah's repeated invitations to remain behind might suggest. And the sons of the prophets who were at Jericho drew near to Elisha and said to him, "Do you know that today the Lord will take away your master from over you?" And he answered, "Yes, I know it. Be silent." 2 Kings 2 verse 5, the same exchange. The same knowledge. The same silence demanded. And then Elijah said to him, "Please stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." But he said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." And the 2 of them went on. 2 Kings 2 verse 6. 50 men of the sons of the prophets also went and stood at some distance from them, as they both were standing by the Jordan. Then Elijah took his cloak and rolled it up and struck the water, and the water was parted to the one side and to the other, until the 2 of them could go over on dry ground. 2 Kings 2 verses 7 to 8, the cloak rolled up and struck the water. The parting of the Jordan. The same river that had parted for Israel when the priests carrying the ark had stepped into it during the conquest of Canaan under Joshua, Joshua 3 verses 15 to 16, parted again at the end of Elijah's life by the cloak of the prophet who had spent his entire ministry demonstrating the sovereignty of the God of Israel over every force of the natural world. The 50 sons of the prophets watching from a distance witnessed the same miraculous event that Israel had witnessed under Joshua, the Jordan parting to allow the passage of God's people. But this time not an entire nation crossing into the promised land. Just two men. A prophet and his disciple. Walking together on dry ground across the river that should have stopped them. And when they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Ask what I shall do for you, before I am taken from you." And Elisha said, "Please let there be a double portion of your spirit on me." 2 Kings 2 verse 9, a double portion of your spirit. The request communicated the depth of Elisha's understanding of what the prophetic calling required and the theological tradition within which he was asking. In the law of Moses, the firstborn son received a double portion of the father's inheritance, not as a reward for greater worth but as the provision for the one who would carry forward the primary responsibilities of the family and the family's legacy. Deuteronomy 21 verse 17, Elisha was asking not for twice as many miracles as Elijah had performed or twice as much prophetic power as a personal achievement, he was asking to be the primary heir, the firstborn son of the prophetic succession, the one who would carry forward the ministry of Elijah with the full weight of the Spirit that had animated it. It was the request of a man who understood the task before him and was asking for the only resource that could make him adequate to it. And Elijah said, "You have asked a hard thing. Yet, if you see me as I am being taken from you, it shall be so for you, but if you do not see me, it shall not be so." 2 Kings 2 verse 10, a hard thing. The condition was not arbitrary, it was the condition that corresponded to the nature of what was being asked for. The double portion of the Spirit was not something that could be granted by a human teacher's will or a formal prophetic commissioning. It was a divine gift that would be confirmed or withheld by the divine action of the departure itself. If Elisha saw, if he was present, attentive, spiritually awake to what was happening in the moment of the translation, then the gift would be confirmed. If he did not see, if the extraordinary nature of the event exceeded his capacity to be present to it, then the request would not be granted. The seeing was not merely physical observation. It was the quality of spiritual attentiveness that could receive and apprehend the divine action in the moment of its occurrence. And as they still went on and talked, behold, a chariot of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. 2 Kings 2 verse 11, a chariot of fire and horses of fire. The language of divine transportation, the same imagery that the prophet Ezekiel would use for the divine throne chariot, the same language that communicates the reality of a heavenly dimension operating within and intersecting with the ordinary geography of the earth. The chariot of fire and the horses of fire did not carry Elijah, they separated the two men, creating the boundary between the one who was departing and the one who was remaining. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. The whirlwind, the same kind of divine atmospheric phenomenon associated with the theophany at Horeb, with the appearance of God in the storm, with the expression of divine power in the natural world, carried the prophet upward. Into heaven. The boundary that separates the earthly from the heavenly, the mortal from the immortal, the seen from the unseen, Elijah crossed it. Alive. Without dying. And Elisha saw it and he cried, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And he saw him no more. 2 Kings 2 verse 12, he saw it. The condition had been met. Elisha had been present, attentive, spiritually awake to what was happening, he had seen. And what he cried in the moment of the departure communicated both the personal grief of losing the man he had called father and the theological understanding of what the presence of Elijah had meant for Israel. My father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. Elijah had been to Israel what a standing army is to a nation, the real defense, the actual source of protection, the genuine strength. Not the political machinery or the military apparatus but the prophet who stood before the living God and spoke the word that determined what would happen to the nation. The chariots of Israel and its horsemen, gone in a whirlwind, taken into heaven, leaving the young prophet standing on the bank of the Jordan with the grief of loss and the condition of the double portion fulfilled. Then he took hold of his own clothes and tore them in two pieces. And he took up the cloak of Elijah that had fallen from him and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. Then he took the cloak of Elijah that had fallen from him and struck the water, saying, Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah? And when he had struck the water, the water was parted to the one side and to the other, and Elisha went over. 2 Kings 2 verses 12 to 14, the cloak of Elijah that had fallen from him. The same cloak that Elijah had cast over Elisha in the field at Abel-meholah to commission him. The same cloak that had parted the Jordan in Elijah's hand. Now in Elisha's hand. And Elisha struck the water with it and said, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" And the water parted. The double portion was real. The God who had answered Elijah was answering Elisha. The inheritance had been transferred. The firstborn of the prophetic succession was standing on the bank of the Jordan with the divided river before him as the first confirmation that what he had asked for had been given. And when the sons of the prophets who were at Jericho saw him opposite them, they said, "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha." And they came to meet him and bowed to the ground before him. 2 Kings 2 verse 15, the spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha. The community of prophets recognized it immediately, not from a theological argument or a formal announcement but from the evidence of the divided Jordan. The same God. The same Spirit. A new prophet. And the ministry of Elisha that followed would demonstrate the double portion in exactly the way that a double portion should be demonstrated, not by being twice as dramatic as Elijah's ministry, not by outdoing the fire from heaven and the rain and the chariot, but by being characterized by more miracles, more consistent pastoral care, more accessibility to ordinary people in their ordinary needs. Where Elijah's ministry had been marked by the dramatic, the confrontational, the large-scale public demonstration, Elisha's ministry would be marked by a quieter and more pervasive expression of divine power through healing, provision, and the restoration of ordinary life. But the significance of Elijah's translation did not end with Elisha's inheritance of the double portion. It extended forward through the entire subsequent history of biblical prophecy and into the New Testament in ways that made Elijah one of the most theologically significant figures in the entire sweep of Scripture. Malachi's promise, "I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes," Malachi 4 verse 5, kept Elijah's name alive in Jewish expectation through the 400 years of prophetic silence. The Jews who came to John the Baptist on the banks of the Jordan and asked him, "Are you Elijah?" were asking within the framework of that expectation. The crowd who heard Jesus ask, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" received among the answers the name Elijah. Some say Elijah. Matthew 16 verse 14, the expectation of Elijah's return was one of the most vivid and most persistent threads of Jewish messianic hope. And then, on a high mountain, 6 days after Peter's confession of Jesus as the Christ, Jesus was transfigured before Peter and James and John. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah, talking with him. Matthew 17 verses 1 to 3, Moses and Elijah. The two representatives of the law and the prophets, the two dimensions of the Old Testament revelation, appearing on the mountain with Jesus in the moment of his transfiguration. The prophet who had received the law at Sinai and the prophet who had heard the whisper of God at Horeb were both present, both visible, both conversing with the one whose coming both of them had, in their different ways, been preparing Israel to receive. And Elijah appeared not as a ghost or a vision but as a recognizable, speaking, present figure, because Elijah had never died. He had been taken. And in the transfiguration on the mountain, he was present in the radiance of the kingdom that his entire life had been pointing toward and serving. Luke's account of the transfiguration adds a detail that the other Gospels do not include: they appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Luke 9 verse 31, his departure. The word translated departure in the Greek is exodos, the same word used for Israel's exodus from Egypt, the defining act of divine deliverance in the Old Testament. Moses and Elijah were discussing the exodus that Jesus was about to accomplish at Jerusalem, the death and resurrection that would constitute the final and definitive deliverance of God's people from the bondage of sin and death. The man who had led the first exodus and the man who had called down fire from heaven and been taken to heaven alive were together on the mountain discussing the accomplishment that their entire ministries had been, in different ways, preparing the ground to receive. The theological significance of Elijah's appearance in the New Testament extends beyond the Transfiguration. The letter of James uses Elijah as the paradigm for effective prayer. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed fervently that it might not rain, and for 3 years and 6 months it did not rain on the earth. Then he prayed again, and heaven gave rain, and the earth bore its fruit. James 5 verses 17 to 18, a man with a nature like ours. The theological point of James's reference was not Elijah's uniqueness or his extraordinary spiritual status, it was his ordinariness. A nature like ours. The same human nature that produced the broom tree despair and the I am the only one left conviction and the running from Jezebel's threat. And from that ordinary human nature, prayer that stopped the rain for 3 years and 6 months and then prayed it back. The encouragement to the ordinary believer was the encouragement of participation in the same God who had answered Elijah, the same God who is as available to every person who prays as he was to the Tishbite who prayed on his knees with his face between his knees on the top of Mount Carmel. And the book of Revelation, in its vision of the 2 witnesses who will prophesy during the period of the Great Tribulation, and if anyone would harm them, fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. They have the power to shut the sky, that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying, and they have power over the waters to turn them into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague. Revelation 11 verses 5 to 6, was drawing on the specific, recognized, unmistakable characteristics of Elijah's ministry. Fire from the mouth. The power to shut the sky. The drought. The 2 witnesses of the apocalyptic vision are universally identified by biblical scholarship as operating in the spirit and power of Moses and Elijah, the 2 figures who had appeared together at the Transfiguration, who together represented the fullness of the Old Testament revelation, and whose ministries provide the typological template for the final prophetic witness at the end of the age. Elijah's story ends, or rather, does not end, on the bank of the Jordan, in a whirlwind, in the chariot of fire and the horses of fire, going up into heaven. And it continues in every subsequent generation of the biblical story and beyond the biblical story into the history of the church and the expectation of the consummation, in John the Baptist who came in the spirit and power of Elijah, in the 2 witnesses of Revelation who operate in the same prophetic mode, in every believer who has ever knelt in prayer with the same ordinary human nature as the Tishbite and discovered that the God who answered Elijah answers still. The prophet who never died teaches every generation of the faithful something essential about the God he served, that this God is sovereign over the rain and the fire and the boundary between life and death and the boundary between earth and heaven. That he provides for his servants in the most unlikely ways, by ravens and by widow's flower and by angelic food beside a broom tree. That he speaks in the whisper after the fire to the prophets who have given everything and believe they are completely alone. That there are always 7,000 who have not bowed, always a remnant preserved in ways that the exhausted and isolated prophet cannot see. That the double portion of the Spirit is available to those who stay close enough to see the departure. And that the God who took Elijah in a whirlwind is the God who will one day take his people to be with him, not in a chariot of fire on the Jordan but in the resurrection that the one Moses and Elijah discussed on the mountain of transfiguration accomplished at Jerusalem for all who believe. Elijah went up. And the cloak fell. And Elisha picked it up. And the water parted. And the God of Elijah was still there. He always was. He always is. He always will be.